Reading with your kids.
Hola, ni hao, konnichiwa, assalamu alaikum, shalom, mahaba, wanji, namaste, jumbo, bienvenidos. Hi, my name is Jedley, and this is the Reading with Your Kids podcast. We are coming to you from the beautiful neighborhood of Reedville in the southwest corner of Boston, Massachusetts. We are so delighted and so very honored that you're joining us in our mission to help all families grow closer through reading. Please be sure to tell all of your family and friends about the show. Please be sure to subscribe to the show on the iHeartRadio app, on Spotify, Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Himalaya, Ghana, Good Pods, wherever you find your podcasts. Two wonderful guests today celebrating Love is Loud. The author, Sandra Wallace, and the illustrator, Bryan Collier. Before we invite our guests into the studio, we want to invite you to connect with us on social media. Facebook.com/readingwithyourkids, at Reading With Your Kids on Instagram, at Jedley Magic on Twitter. Be sure to check out our Reading With Your Kids Pinterest page and also our YouTube channel. And of course, we would love it if you could visit our website, readingwithyourkids.com. You can click on the contact button up at the top of the page to send us a message and let us know what you love about the show. You can also let us know what you don't love about the show. But most importantly, you can let us know who you would like to hear on a future episode of the Reading With Your Kids podcast. Really excited. We have two great guests speaking today about a really important book. The name of the book is Love is Loud, How Diane Nash Led the Civil Rights Movement. Please welcome to the show the author, Sandra Wallace. Sandra, good morning.
Good morning. It's great to be here with you and Bryan.
And the Bryan that Sandra is referring to is the illustrator of the book, Bryan Collier. Bryan, how are you? Welcome.
I'm doing well. It's a pleasure to be here.
Let's start with you, Sandra. Tell us all about Diane Nash.
Well, Diane Nash is one of the most influential and effective leaders of the civil rights movement of the 1960s. She's as integral as Martin Luther King Jr. and John Lewis. Everything, if you think about it, that Diane led in the fight for change, she won. That included integrating Nashville's lunch counters through the Nashville sit-ins, integrating bus travel with the Freedom Rides, and securing voting rights for Black Americans in the South through the passing of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Yet most people don't know who she is. And she did all this, Jed, by being motivated by love. It's really why we start our book with this great quote from Diane Nash that says, the nonviolent movement is based upon and motivated by love. So really the title of our book, Love is Loud, is a reminder about love being at the heart of justice, that love is a verb, it's transformative, and it's really a leadership quality. So the principles of nonviolence that Diane Nash followed were really rooted in such a loud love for humanity that it fueled brave actions to dismantle segregation and not cooperate with hate.
Well, there's so much there to unpack. But the thing I want to focus on is what you just said, that love is a verb. And I think that is something that a lot of us forget from time to time.
Yeah, and it's a through line that Bryan and I really carry throughout the book.
Yeah.
So, Bryan, can you talk a little bit about your the feelings when you were first approached about this project?
Oh, I was super excited about telling this story. And for me, it feels like it's the only picture book ever done on Diane Nash, and I knew of her story, and by just doing research and seeing the old footage of this young person just knee deep in service and sacrifice. They're the two key components, along with the love as well, is that service and sacrifice. Because with all the efforts put forth by everyone, there's a sacrifice that takes place as well. That is key and is important as well. To speak to courage and speak to that love as well. So I was head over heels to do this story.
Sandra, one of the things that I'm really thankful that you mentioned is that, we really haven't heard about Diane, most folks, and that her story hasn't been told to this point. I'm happy that you said that, because I was sitting here, I was very young during the 60s, but I hadn't heard of Diane. Why do you think that is?
Well, you're certainly not the only one, Jed. Most adults haven't heard of Diane Nash. And as Bryan said, this is the first picture book biography centering Diane. Black women leaders in the 1950s and 60s, like Diane, faced both racism and gender discrimination. The women's movement started after the civil rights movement. And as Diane Nash says in so many interviews, that was a real problem. Her impact was equal to or surpassed the magnitude of many male leaders in the movement, but she didn't receive that equal treatment or attention. And it's why most people don't know who she is. Young readers have access to lots of books about Dr. King and also John Lewis, but not Diane Nash. So as Bryan said, this is the first picture book biography on Diane, and it's one story. And I'm really hoping that there will be more books for young readers centering Diane Nash.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Bryan, what was it about? I don't know much about visual art in terms of creating it, but we have a new project here at the podcast called Drawing with Your Kids, and so I'm learning a little bit, and I'm hearing from some authors that there's oftentimes one thing about a person that is, kind of sparks an illustrator when they start creating. Does that make sense? Is there something about Diane that really kind of drove your illustrations of her?
Well, yes, there's a key moment. There's a key moment when Diane was organizing the Freedom Rides down south, the students to go down south to invoke voter registration and all that stuff. And President Kennedy sent one of his assistants down. He said, "Who is Diane Nash?" So when the president of the United States calls your name, that means something's going on. Something's big about to happen. And so he sent his representative down to speak directly to Diane Nash, and he was trying to warn us that there's a mob waiting for y'all. You're gonna get somebody killed. Y'all really are gonna be in trouble. Please don't do this. This bus ride down south. This integrated bus ride down south. And Diane was all of 20 years old, and she said, "Last night we signed our death certificates. We're ready to die, and we're going." And that's the thing. It sent me to the moon, because she was all in. She jumped off the ledge. They were all in, all of them.
Yeah.
But led by this young. And think about it. Oftentimes, these students were the first in their family ever to go to college. So they're there, and they said, "Wait a minute. There's something bigger than college. We're going to risk it all and risk our lives too."
Yeah.
So that pivotal moment was the thing that got me for Diane. So I've been chasing her story for years to tell, and finally we got it together.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, Jed, I feel so fortunate to be a creative with Bryan on Love is Loud, and that we really collaborated on this story from the beginning. And it's also the first time that I've incorporated second person narration and some poetic prose. And I definitely don't consider myself a poet, but Bryan really trusted that vision and elevated it in such a beautiful and powerful way. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. It's been a pleasure. I miss you so much. I'm waiting for us to get together and do some signings and talks together, because we haven't been together since our last project. So I'm really, really biting at the bit to get together and really celebrate this book, Sandra.
Can't wait. Yeah, Jed, this is our second collaboration together. We, in 2018, had a book come out called Between the Lines, which centers Ernie Barnes, the NFL player and iconic artist. So, I knew about Diane Nash. I first learned about her in about 2012 when I was in Selma, Alabama, conducting interviews for an older book for young adults called Blood Brother. Jonathan Daniels was a seminarian and voting rights activist, but it really wasn't until Bryan and I were talking about, after Between the Lines in 2019, that the subject of Diane Nash kept coming up, and just realizing her leaderships and what she did in the movement. And we knew that we had to collaborate on a book centering her.
Well, Bryan, one of the things that I've discovered doing the Reading with Your Kids podcast is that it's very unusual for an illustrator and an author to be actively collaborating from start to finish. Typically, a publisher buys a manuscript and then finds an illustrator and passes the manuscript on to the illustrator. How is it that you two were so connected with this project from the very start?
Well, you're correct when you say the publishers, they really wanted to keep us separate, the author and the illustrator. So the author finishes the text and then it's turned over to the illustrator, and the illustrator's job is to illuminate, expand, and run a visual storyline that's parallel to the text to make a dynamic book. But what I've discovered after doing 45 or more books so far is, we can go even further if me and Sandra or me and the writer get together and really talk about it. Let's really deconstruct making a picture book and really talk about our wants and our desires and our needs. It's like a buddy of mine was talking about collaboration, what that really means, and how to listen to each other. He's in advertising, and he says he approaches his business like the Avengers. Everybody comes with their superpowers, and you're going to have a successful project. Everybody's superpowers are needed. So everything is valid. So we need it all. So I want to work closer and closer with my collaborator to do a dynamic book.
I love that. I love that. Sandra, one of the things that you said was that you don't consider yourself a poet, but that Bryan really pushed you to, include prose in the story. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, it's the second person narration really came to me after we had discussions. And I just want to also say too, it's interesting that we write and we collaborate on people who break barriers. So of course we're going to break the barrier between the author and the illustrator, as well. So, that really came to me. There's this beautiful quote where Diane explains why she did what she did. And she said, although we had not met you, and she's really addressing young people directly, we loved you. And we were trying to bring about the best society that we could for you to be born into. So for me, that second person narrative kept coming up to me as the closest, most direct way to acknowledge Diane Nash's loving actions and the hope that she held for America's future. And then that build upon what type of text would honor that, and it was shorter, more staccato, yet flowing, poetry-like prose. And Bryan really, really supported me on that.
Very, very. This is an incredibly powerful story, and at the same time, for me, it's frustrating because, as I mentioned, I was alive in the 60s. I remember sitting and hearing Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech on the news and sitting with my dad and both of us agreeing that what a beautiful speech and dream that is. But it seems that we're, here it is, 60-something years later, and we're still fighting this fight. Bryan, are we any closer to achieving Dr. King's dream?
Well, I've talked about, life is about ebbs and flows, and the pursuit of a perfect union and love and all, it requires constant work. It's never a landing place. It's never a place where never a place where you arrive to. Even in Dr. King's dream, it was never a stopping point. It was always perpetually in motion. Mm-hmm. That means we all have to stay active and stay on and then remind our children of the past mistakes and the past challenges in order to move it further. I mean, even if it's an inch further, so it's always in perpetual motion. So no, there's never a place where you stop. The mantra of love and togetherness and happiness and I have a dream and all those things. There's always work to be done.
Yeah.
And Jed, this was Diane Nash's dream too. We always associate this with Dr. King's dream, but, Diane Nash had this dream as well, and her courage and conviction made her one of the most persistent, consistent, and successful leaders of the civil rights movement. You look at how her actions motivated thousands to follow her lead, and she really knew that if enough people stood up to hate through powerful, peaceful actions, then justice prevails, positive change happens, and love wins. So Diane Nash is just this real icon of freedom, and I hope that she inspires children to be future leaders and stand up for what's right.
Absolutely. The idea that we can inspire our kids to go out and act and realize that love is a verb, and to put that verb into action into every moment of their lives. Sandra, I'm going to ask both of you this question. Sandra, what kind of conversations do you think a family can have as they're sitting together reading Love is Loud?
Well, it's really important for us to have honest conversations about our history. Diane provides a template for what she did for freedom, for equality, and she really refused to cooperate with hate. And I think that, talking directly to how that can impact your daily lives in school, as a family, looking at specific ways to stand up to hate and use the love in your heart to find ways to do this. Really,
really, really important. I love that. Bryan, what kind of conversations do you think families can have?
Well, I speak directly to the words on the page as well as the imagery. I mean, look at the opening shot of a loving family welcoming into the new baby Diane into the world. But they know what's out that window. They know the challenges. They know the segregated world and the world of post-slavery is right out that window in the midst of this love that they're embracing their child. And then all the instances that give you all the facets of love, not this, sentimental bosh that Dr. King called it. It's never, love is powerful and strong and courageous. And love is sitting at a lunch counter for a cause, knowing they're going to pour this hot coffee over your head. And you convince all your friends, all your colleagues, all your classmates, hey, this is more important. Come sit down and risk it all right here. That's all. That's a facet of love as well. There's no way. It's hard to get two people. It's hard to get your children to follow you. Now, how you gonna get thousands of people that don't even know you to follow you? So there's something that, that radiates from this kind of internal love that you're projecting, and that you're performing in the midst of this terror. So we display that through all the imagery as well, and what my job is to create an apparatus to hang those words on, and that's the images to give you a continual storyline and an ideal that we're trying to put forth in Love is Loud.
Sandra, Diane sounds like such an incredibly courageous young person, and not only to stand up to racism, but to deal with the discrimination she felt being a young woman working with these older men. Where do you think she found the courage to stand up and to spread this message of love?
Well, love is at the center of the principles of nonviolence. And, I go back to that quote that just stays with me that, she did what she did because she loved the future Americans yet unborn and was really risking everything for a better society that she could be responsible for in the future. So she wasn't only thinking about her own freedom, she was thinking about the freedom of future Americans. And you talk about the power of love, which Bryan alluded to, is this action that she was just completely unwilling at any moment to cooperate with racism, which was through segregation, and she did that in a beautiful, dignified way. One of the quotes that I really like that Diane says is that hating people is not the solution to solving human problems. So what it is confronting that hate with peaceful, powerful actions. And that's exactly what she did, and really her motivation for that was really galvanized once she got to Tennessee. Because growing up in Chicago, her parents and her family did a lot to insulate her from segregation. She also went to Hyde Park High School, which was one of the most diverse schools in Chicago at the time in the early 1950s. So she faced overt segregation once she became a student at Fisk University. And when she goes to Tennessee, which her grandmother was from, and she visits that Tennessee State Fair and experiences life in Nashville, it's a turning point for her. She sees segregated bathrooms at the State Fair. She can't eat with her friends at lunch counters, and she's infuriated and humiliated, and her commitment to the civil rights movement is really galvanized. And she refused to that saying, go along to get along. So she finds like-minded students who are willing to take actions to crush segregation through those nonviolent ways. And they meet at a church, and Reverend Lawson teaches them what's called passive resistance techniques attributed to Mohandas Gandhi. And at first, Diane herself even questions if she can really stop segregation with love and nonviolence. But then she becomes convinced that you can, and she leads the Nashville sit-ins, with a diverse group of students who, after being refused service, silently sit at those lunch counters, their actions saying that you can throw sugar in our hair, coffee down our necks, or worse, but we are not leaving. And if you arrest us, hundreds of other students will take our seats, and more will take their seats until segregation ends and everyone can eat at the lunch counters. So over time that works. And, you heard Bryan talk about that and about those actions, and how Diane had a way to convince hundreds of people to do that.
Yeah. Bryan, I'm curious, have you ever had a chance to speak with Diane and is any reaction to the book or to your work from her?
Oh, it was a near miss. I'm from the Eastern Shore of Maryland, and she was speaking at Salisbury University down there. And I had just left there the week before, and I didn't know she was coming, and she was down there, so I just missed her. So I never got a chance to, but we were in the same place but different times. But I'm certainly hopeful that we will talk now that this book is out.
Right.
Yeah, I really hope to too. Jed, I had the opportunity to connect with Diane several years ago, and she very kindly let me know that she no longer conducts interviews. Mm-hmm. So because she's a public figure, gratefully, I was really able to use the resources of so many documented interviews that she's done over these past 60 years to glean insight on who she is and what she stood for. And like Bryan said earlier in the interview, we relied on newspapers, film footage, arrest records, letters. I'm actually looking at the 4 huge tubs of information, that letter that Diane wrote in jail. It took It took us 6 months, more than 6 months, to find that letter and to get that. And we quote some of that letter from jail in our book, which is just so powerful.
Wow. I think that this is a really important book that would be an amazing addition to certainly any classroom library, but in also any family library. I want to know where we can go to find out more about Love is Loud, and also find out more about both of you. So why don't we start with you, Bryan? Where can you go to find out more about you?
Oh, you can go to my my Etsy. Well, you can go on Amazon.com and Bryan Collier there. But I have an Etsy account that you can type in Bryan Collier, and you can see some art that I have available as well. But you can just Google my name, and a lot of things can pop up.
Wonderful, wonderful. And Sandra, what about you? Where can we go to find out more about you?
Well, first, I'm excited to let you know more about where you can find out about Diane Nash. So at the end of our book, we have a lot of back matter, several pages of back matter. And in there are resources for a deeper dive into the life of Diane Nash and how she changed America. We have historic photographs of Diane integrating Nashville's lunch counters in 1960. And we have lots of links to videos about Diane, especially the day that she received the 2022 Presidential Medal of Freedom, which is the highest civilian honor that happened in July of 2022. And then for me, you can also head to my website, sandraneilwallace.com, and you can download the Love is Loud discussion guide there.
Wonderful. Well, we've had a really, I think we just started to scratch the surface of this topic, and I hope that both of you come back on in the future to maybe talk more about this and also talk more about other projects that you might be working on. We've had a really fun time speaking to the author and illustrators of Love is Loud, How Diane Nash Led the Civil Rights Movement. And our guests have been the author, Sandra Neil Wallace, and the illustrator, Bryan Collier. Bryan, Sandra, thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thanks for all you're doing to inspire families to read true stories and have meaningful conversations around them.
Please be sure to join us for the next episode of the Reading with Your Kids podcast. One of our favorite guests, our Dean of all things STEM and STEAM, Jennifer Swanson, is joining us once again to share some wisdom for authors. It's a really fascinating conversation if you are an author, if you're an aspiring author, if you have a kid who loves to write. You want to listen to the show. Jennifer shares some very, very valuable tips about how you can make your writing more powerful. That's the next episode of the show. I want to thank the folks who made today's show so wonderful. Of course, we want to start by thanking our guests, the author and illustrator of Love is Loud, Sandra Neil Wallace, and Bryan Collier. I want to thank my team, Fatima Khan, Rory Grady, Jordan Saley, Stephanie Davila, Will Cheever. I want to thank my beautiful wife for all the support she gives me. Most of all, we all want to thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. And as always, thank you so very much for taking the time to make the world a better place by reading with your kids. I'll be looking for you in the next edition of the Reading with Your Kids podcast.